I can't be the only one who thinks it's a crime that this plane gets remembered from only one fight in the war when it held the Allied line everywhere until the big guns showed up. So let's fix that. I hope you brought your war face, because today we're going to talk about the P-40 Warhawk, also known as the Tomahawk or the Kitty Hawk.
Now let me see your war face!
Most of this aircraft's historical spotlight comes under the name of the Flying Tigers, who were the first major unit to give the Japanese the inclination that it might be more fun to make anime than war. But in reality, this aircraft became the World War II incarnation of a good plan now is better than a perfect plan later. A stopgap solution is typically thought of as nothing more than a throwaway item meant to fill in the line until a better solution comes along, and that is exactly what the P-40 was. But the Warhawk would also make it crystal clear to everyone in the war that there's no written rule that a throwaway has to be complete garbage, and even stopgap solutions can hang in there for a few years.
My attacks have no effect on you? Who decided that?
The P-40 was only ever brought to life because it was the most available option, and yet that available fighter saved the Allies from having their air forces overrun all over the world time and time again. And as an added bonus, it even proved that communism doesn't work from inside the Soviet military. Not everyone liked it, and it had its drawbacks, but it did its job, and in the right hands, it wasn't just lethal, it was competitive. It took some practice to master the machine no matter who was flying it, but once that skill set was down pat, every one of the Axis powers had to watch their rear end if they didn't want the Warhawk's shark bite and the 200 aces it made taking a bite out of them, sometimes literally. But if there was one thing that took everyone by surprise, both the producers and the users, it was the fact that it got the lifespan of something brand new out of what was only supposed to be a late-game patch to something old. The P-40 was almost a direct modification of Curtis's previous work, the P-36 Hawk. This was one of America's interwar all-metal monoplane designs, something to hold the industry in place while the Great Depression tore the economy in half over its back. And in 1937, the lead designer had the idea to use a liquid-cooled engine to increase the P-36's relatively mediocre speed. Even if it only offered no difference in power outright, it was still easier to streamline the casing for a liquid-cooled engine than a radial, which flew like a brick wall to give as much of the engine's surface area access to the air for cooling. And as a result, this generally meant that liquid-cooled engines might yield faster planes than air-cooled ones. Unless you're Pratt & Whitney.
Y'all built different. I'm built incorrectly. I'm just raw in every way.
I should not exist.
I should not exist.
And the newest mass-produced liquid-cooled engine block on the block was the Allison V1710 V12 engine. So Curtis drew up a prototype on paper called the XP-37 and threw it at the Army Air Corps. The Army was intrigued enough to order a prototype, most likely due to the proposed speed, because it sure as hell wasn't the visibility.
Guys, I can't see.
And while the April 1937 test flight did prove it was fast, the turbocharger they used was so unreliable that it was basically foreshadowing the Abrams diesel proposal by eating itself alive. So that idea got thrown out the window, but Curtis wouldn't be waiting very long for a second chance, because in 1938, Congress was getting a little worried about Japan and Germany starting to eat more than their fair share of the world, which is one of the two ways you make money move into the military in the US. You either impress Congress or scare them into a change of pants. Now being the latter, Congress approved funding for a new Army fighter, and that year the Army made their request. But if you compared it to the planes coming out in places like Europe, where battles were being fought above 20,000 feet, these requirements looked almost like sabotage. The only things they wanted were for the plane to go between 310 and 370 miles an hour tops at an altitude of 15,000 feet and to be available at double speed. Range and reliability were more important than altitude and agility, but otherwise the bidders just had to fill in the blanks. See, at the time, nobody in America besides maybe the president was expecting to go to war, and so Army brass felt the biggest need for a fighter aircraft was to defend America, not attack somewhere else. Specifically, they thought they'd have to defend the American coast against an enemy D-Day, hence the focus on low altitude. That also meant they cared more about multi-classing into ground pounders than interceptors, because nobody at the time had bombers that could reach the star-spangled shores. Yet. Faster and higher flying bombers were being developed around the world, including by America, but Army brass didn't think they needed escorts, something a certain Claire Lee Chennault saw the weakness of early on. And so the people writing the rules looked at the high-altitude fighters and were like, nah, we'll be fine.
What an idiot!
And even if they did think they might have needed interceptors, if the XP-37 was any indication, they would need magic or a miracle to make planes that could get into the Cloud9 secret stash overnight. High-altitude flight was just out of the question, and the Army didn't bother to ask. So in response to these requirements, Curtiss basically repeated the process from before. They drew a plane that looked fast enough, the Army bought a prototype, and Curtiss built it using a production P-36. However, the first test flight on October 14, 1938 didn't look promising. The takeoff was unstable, the climb rate was only 2/3 that of the older P-36 it was based on, and it barely broke 300 miles an hour at 12,000 feet. Translation, the new plane is worse than the old one, and it took until the next month for them to put it through enough wind tunnel tests to fix most of the issues, and even then it still wasn't ready until right before the competitive trials in May 1939. Also, apparently, to Curtiss, ready just meant it was able to get in the air, not do everything on the brochure, because it was still 20 miles an hour slower than promised. The only real reason the XP-40 was really chosen for production was because it fit the contract requirements of being the most available solution. Everything else would take a year or more longer to get on the assembly line, and so the P-40 was given the largest contract since World War I that same year, paying $12.9 million for 524 planes.
I'll take your entire stock!
Thankfully, Curtiss didn't take the P-40's impotence lying down because they would continue to tweak it up to standard through its entering production in March 1940, and the first production aircraft would fly in April before the Army finally got their hands on one in June. And you'll have to excuse the more summarized version of this part of the history because the American Warhawks, the Lend-Lease Tomahawks and Kitty Hawks, and the export H-81A and H-87As were all slightly different in their own ways. It'd be like trying to climb the stairs to the Eiffel Tower. I've been to the Eiffel Tower, and I refuse to climb that many stairs, with my feet or my voice. So for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to describe the general flow of the tech tree using the American numbers as a guide. The first 200 planes off the line were just called the P-40s, and they very much resembled the idea of being just what was available. They had kamikaze levels of pilot protection, their external options could be best described as no, and they only carried 4 guns, 2 50 cals in the nose and 2 303s in the wings. It also used the same exact wing profile as the P-36, but had a tougher and thus heavier structure. Add that to all the other weight that got added from the P-36, and those wings are carrying the P-40 harder than clutching a game as the last man standing or that one button holding a shirt closed that's 2 sizes too small for the rack underneath. That meant a higher wing loading, which means less agility, and compared to its predecessor, it turned like a brick, though compared to everything else in the world then, it was actually pretty on par. But the P-40 still had a hard time getting it up to shaft the enemy, as the French and the British would notice when they ordered the H-81A1s and Tomahawk Mark 1s. Gas station pills don't really work on planes, so they would call back to the factory and ask for some more permanent improvements. The resulting P-40B and C models would then get some additional luxuries, like bulletproof glass, seatback armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks on top of its all-alloy airframe and alclad aluminum hybrid skin. So now you only call a doctor if it's not hard for longer than 4 hours, plus it got a new jawline when they made the cooling systems easier to get at. Tack on 2 more wing-mounted 30 cals, plus provisions for either a centerline bomb rack or a 52-gallon drop tank, and the P-40s were starting to look like a bit of a gym bro. But much like a gym bro, getting bigger means getting heavier and usually slower. And the P-40's workout routine pushed the plane's empty weight up to 5,812 pounds or 2,636 kilos, and its max takeoff weight to 8,058 pounds or 3,655 kilos. With that extra weight, the 1040 horsepower 1710-33 engine could only give the plane a max available speed of 345 miles or 555 knot miles an hour, and a combat range of only 240 miles or 386 knot miles. So bigger muscles, still impotent, not good enough. So these early P-40s were replaced on the production line by August 1941 with the upgraded P-40Ds and Es, which would eventually evolve into their successors, the F, K, L, M, and N models. These P-40s had such a different build overall that while America followed the KISS principle and kept calling it the Warhawk, the export models and British models got different names, the H-87A and the Kitty Hawk. These later stage flying type Pokemon on got their gains bit by bit to things like firepower, ordnance load, and engine power. Power increased from 1040 horsepower to 1350, and typical ordnance became 650 cals and 2,000 pounds of bombs, usually a 500-pounder centerline and 650-pounders, 200-pounders, or two 250s under wing. They would also get a longer fuselage and vertical tail placement because the earlier models like to roll over like a seal in a hard dive, and your pullout game generally suffers when it also has to fight physics. But if you were to draw the effect of all these upgrades on the P-40's stats, it would look like a damn circle. The P-40's impotence was starting to look like it needed a dysfunction diagnosis because none of its final forms could ever really get past the speed and range they started with. So faster and better inversion of the bullet-to-air ratio was really the only box checked. So, at least they got the important one. The P-40F and L models even tried equipping the Merlin engines, named for their ability to turn any attached aircraft into a piece of fucking wizardry. Unless it's a P-40 apparently, in which case it might as well have been built with the Salem witch trials in mind, burning every trace of magical capability it came across. So not willing to waste their Magic Academy training on a muggle, the US would put an end to that idea and reallocate all Merlin engines to the P-51s in 1943.
You're just mad because I wore it better.
With weight being such a problem, the P-40L and N models tried to go on a diet, but the lean build meant sacrifices in firepower and range that the pilots wanted to keep. It's easier to work around the shafting problem if you have the tools to finesse it, so they decided they'd rather fly a tank with more weapons available than to try and make it turn harder, and the weight they'd lost came back pretty quick. 13,738 P-40s of all types would be built before its production ended on November 30th, 1944, making it the third most produced American fighter of the war, behind only the P-51 in second place and the P-47 in first. And overall, they turned out to be pretty sound fighters. Above 15,000 feet, forget it, you might as well be flying a casket. But at low altitudes and high speeds, the P-40 could hand you your tail on a silver platter if you weren't careful. In that low-down, high-speed arena, it took pretty much the most maneuverable fighters like the Spitfire and the Zero to outfly the Warhawk completely. And a report from Jagdgeschwader 54, or JG-54, wrote that in horizontal maneuvers, the P-40, probably the later models, could even keep up with the later model Bf-109Fs. But it was still heavy, and while that did translate to surviving attacks most planes wouldn't have, it meant it both ran and climbed so slow that the only real punches it was guaranteed to throw and survive were diving strikes and head-on passes. Basically playing a giant game of chicken at several hundred miles an hour, or a drive-by with a plane. So a P-40 had to take the right position if they wanted to make the enemy feel it. When you don't have a lot to work with, technique suddenly matters a lot more, and if you didn't have your technique down, you could roll in and the fight would go something like this.
I'll swing on him.
I'm pretty sure you just despawned.
In all honesty, there were probably mechanics out there who liked the P-40s more than some of the pilots, because it was like a flying AK. The plane could face tank dirty and sandy conditions fairly easily, and fixing it wasn't a hard challenge. If nothing else would start, the P-40 would, which was a really good perk to have because they would need that reliability from the moment they showed up in combat. Africa in 1941, as the British learned, was a very unfriendly environment. Sandy, far from home, and unusually for this time of year, full of enough Germans to make Britain think the pinwheel pushers had copied their colonial homework. The first P-40s they'd received, the Tomahawk Mark Is, had been restricted to training roles because of their Japanese levels of pilot protection and not being able to keep pace with the 20,000-foot plus air-to-air combat going on over Europe. But when they bought 930 P-40Cs, called the Tomahawk 2Bs, these had more pilot protection, and better yet, the Germans were having an awful lot of fun in its altitudinal wheelhouse over in Africa. The Hurricanes and Gladiator biplanes down there were having a hell of a time trying to keep the sand out of their planes and the blood in their bodies against the Germans, Vichy French, and a fine assortment of Italian snacks.
Anyone else got sand in their
Yes! Everywhere!
And the Tomahawks were hungry with a mind to fix that. If you're not catching my drift here, these P-40s are about to turn that mindset into a grind set and grind the Germans into bratwurst. They're about to teach these guys that the reason we call them crooked crosses is because America's here to straighten them out just to show them who their god is. So the Brits send these new planes over there and they would level the playing field immediately. The 40 was by no means the end-all be-all, let's get that straight. But it was more than available to hand the Germans an ass-whooping. And so their arrival would result in a rapid Uno reverse card for British combat tallies, and the creation of the first of the P-40's 200 aces on July 7, 1941, an Australian pilot named Clive Caldwell. Caldwell would go on to become Australia's ace of aces with 28.5 kills, 20.5 of which he would score in the Tomahawk, making him a quadruple ace in the P-40 alone, as well as the highest scoring P-40 pilot ever. The main enemy threat over early African skies was the German Bf-109E, which climbed faster, flew higher, and dove slower than the Tomahawks. So the common British tactic was to let the 109s dive on them from above, then dodge it or cross your fingers that the plane could eat the lead being slung at it, then turn around and let the Germans know there was a new graveyard available on the floor below it. Which makes sense. I mean, if you can't get it up, you do tend to default to being on the bottom a bit more. But to their credit, that didn't mean they were underperforming. It took the mass arrival of Bf-109Fs and Italian C-202s to really slow the P-40s down in air-to-air combat. But aside from ground fire, they were about the only thing that could really threaten the Tomahawks. Many were lost to both those sources during the siege of Tobruk, but they also had several major victories in the ensuing campaign, like when 15 P-40s ran into an all-you-could-eat buffet of 70 different German and Italian planes, both bombers and escort fighters. Despite being outnumbered by the escorts alone, let alone 6-1 by the entire formation, they would descend on that feast like a cougar picking up college boys, and pick up 9 confirmed kills to the loss of 2 of the boys, along with 3 probable and 8 more damaged. Then on December 5th, 22 Tomahawks would run into 40 Stuka dive bombers with both German and Italian escorts. The Tomahawks took out 14 Stukas to the loss of 5 Tomahawks, with Caldwell himself knocking out 5 and becoming an ace in a day. And they did all this while sand and heat was leaving only half the P-40 fleet combat capable at any given time. Naturally, this gave the P-40 a very appreciable reputation by the Brits, who thought much more highly of it than its own creators would begin to in just 2 days. It's December 7th, 1941, and the aircraft at Pearl Harbor's 2 main airfields are parked close together to guard against the main suspected enemy of the time, sabotage. However, little did they realize that they had already joined the game as Player 2, and it wasn't very hard for the Japanese Player 1 to notice the target-rich environment. Wheeler Field was hit hard by the incoming waves of Japanese bombers and fighters, and all but 4 P-40s and 2 P-36s got deleted. But those 6 planes were a lot more than Hickam Field could manage, because that place was basically uninstalled. So, having their hands full, America's main characters of the day didn't come from either of those places. Instead, they flew out from a 3rd airfield fairly close by at Haliwa that the Japanese had made the mistake of leaving alone, which was the temporary home of the 47th Pursuit Squadron. Most of the credit for American air action of the day is usually given to 2 of the 47th's pilots, 2nd Lieutenant George Welch and 2nd Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, who would survive a Japanese strafing run on the drive to the runway before taking off. Welch would score the first kill on a Japanese aircraft in World War II with only 3 of his 4 guns actually working, followed closely by his wingman Taylor. And both kills were impressive because the 47th, like the rest of America, was so unprepared for this fight that only their 30 cals were loaded, and some pilots took off without any ammo at all for that matter. Shortly after racking up a 3rd kill, the 2 planes would finish planting the rest of their freedom seeds and have to go get more. So these madmen decide to land at Wheeler Field while the uninstall wizard is still running to go gun shopping like it's an old Walmart. Taylor, who's bleeding, then gets lectured by a senior officer in the middle of this fight for some stupid reason, like he isn't out here making more of a difference in the war than that guy, before he's ironically saved by a Japanese attack run sending Captain Dumbass there scattering for the hills. They get off the ground for round 2, hand the Japanese 3 more fatalities, then land to rearm a 2nd time at Halewa. But by the time they took off again, the Japanese force had left and it was all over. The Japanese attack had destroyed 73 P-40s on the ground, making up almost half the total 151 planes lost. Taylor and Welch would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for their combat actions, and they would also become the inspiration for the main characters in the 1970 movie Tora 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 and the 2001 film Pearl Harbor.
I believe the French even have a word for that. An homage, sir.
That's bullshit, Macaulay. But it's very, very good bullshit.
However, at the beginning of that story I said usually two because there was also a third noteworthy person in the fight, Second Lieutenant John L. Danes. And there's apparently research to suggest that he was the one who got America's first air-to-air kill, while flying a P-40 for his first 2 runs. After those, his plane had been shot to shit and he had to land to pick up a spare P-36 to get back in there. But when he returned from that flight and made his landing approach, somebody on the ground misidentified his radial engine plane, which looked roughly similar to Japanese planes of the time, and shot him down and killed him with friendly fire. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his bravery, but it's a fairly sound suspicion that the lack of a romantic ending is why he never got any public credit. But he, Taylor, Welsh, and others would teach the Japanese one lesson. Even if America was to be soundly spanked, it would still rise to fight. And the Japanese paid that tuition with 29 planes. But they seemed to be slow learners, because the Imperial Japanese would run face first into American P-40s once again a day later over the Philippines. The pilots here were more prepared for a fight than at Pearl Harbor. They'd been spending the last few weeks turning the ground next to their planes into a mattress. But with how some of the circumstances worked out, it was almost like divine intervention stopped them from being effective. The P-40s that were on patrol got lost in a cloud bank and missed the bombers entirely, only to land at Clark Airfield, refuel, and get caught in the carpet bombing when it cratered the taxiway. Other P-40s from Iba Airfield got airborne, but some of them had problems with engine seizures because the planes were about as new as the pilots. Some of you car folks out there might know that cars run better when you're constantly using them, and prop planes with piston engines have the same deal. And when they're fresh out the factory, they haven't been run at all, and thus they aren't really ready for use. Even engines need lube. You can't just raw dog it and expect everything to work out fine. You gotta get the seals wet and let the pistons file down any manufacturing imperfections to have the engine at 100%. And that means running the engine on low power in a process sometimes called slow timing. And these P-40s were so freshly delivered, they hadn't had that done yet. Landing and takeoff accidents also took their pound of flesh, or steel, from the numbers, because the rookie pilots had a hard time landing these heavier P-40s, usually putting them down so hard they'd crack the landing gear. I guess they couldn't handle the cowgirl. So while they weren't just outright deleted on the ground with carpet bombing as the Japanese had probably hoped, the Warhawk forces were still pretty much a fly on the wall for the entire invasion, and I mean the entire invasion. P-40s would continue fighting over the Philippines until the last Japanese victory at Mindanao, after which the surviving planes would be evac'd into the South Pacific. But while this was going on, in fact only 2 days after the fighting had started, on December 10th, 1941, the Flying Tigers would set off on their first mission to re-educate the Japanese in how to make fire. They were equipped with a mix of H-81As, P-40Bs, and later P-40Es, and their first attack run would see 4 of the 10 bombers the Japanese sent shot down using the Bamboo radar, an early warning system built to give the slow-climbing P-40s enough advance notice to get to altitude, and the tactics learned from Claire Chennault's training. High-speed diving and slashing attacks in 2-ship groups. Exactly the kind of flying the P-40 did best. No dogfights, only death, just kill 'em and leave. No gentlemanly duels would be fought here. They would continue to turn Japanese planes into incendiary bombs until July 15th, 1942, 11 days after they'd been deactivated and absorbed into the 23rd Fighter Group. And while the numbers can vary pretty widely, it's generally accepted that these P-40s alchemically converted somewhere between 150 to 300 enemy aircraft to danger playgrounds, to the loss of around 23 pilots.
Fine. For my next trick, I'll make you disappear.
However, the P-40s would only achieve a standout performance in American hands in these few places within their first few months of joining the war. Between lazy pilot training, the aggressiveness of Japanese pilots, and the general incompetence and sluggishness of most early war American officers, the Warhawk's bottom nature would turn into something of a pegging problem, and it didn't take long for the plane to get a bad rap as the receiver instead of the giver. But you know what they say, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll spend its entire life thinking it's stupid. So of course people were gonna hate the plane because everything flies like a dump truck when you're dumb enough to turn fight the Japanese. Just look at the Australians, they figured it out. After a few brutal losses with inexperienced pilots, they would learn to convert their downward KD momentum into an upwards path right through the Japanese wing box. Even after the Hurricane and Spitfires arrived to give special attention to Japanese bombers, the P-40 would still be the main attraction for ground support and shipping interdiction, and they were very popular. Using a plane in the role it was intended for makes it shine historically like something atomic lit up your hemisphere, and surprise, surprise, a plane designed for coastal defense shined in the role of coastal defense. Who'da thunk it?
Really? 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 Really?
Which meant that by the time the Japanese tried landing forces to capture Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, the P-40 supporting the defenders there had learned and gained enough skill to drive the Japanese back and force them to abandon the attempt. This victory was one of many that preserved the absolutely vital supply lines coming from North America to keep the Australians in the fight, and a lot of that success was driven by a change of flight doctrine. Experienced pilots switched their air forces to using the same boom and zoom tactics that Claire Chennault had used against the Japanese in China, although the Australians had figured that out from what their veterans had learned in Africa. American P-40s of several squadrons, including the Tuskegee Airmen, would soon be sent to reinforce the RAF and RAAF forces fighting in North Africa in early 1943, this time to make the Vichy French retreat from their African footholds in Operation Torch. But it wasn't always a smooth move. One of the several units sent over, the 33rd Fighter Group, lost 19 of the planes they sailed in with, flying them from a carrier deck off the coast to the airfield at Port Lyautey, 17 of which were again due to more inexperienced landing crashes. Even the ground had more top energy than the P-40 in the hands of a newbie. With so many losses, the unit would delay the remaining transfers for 2 days to try and figure out what the hell was going on. And so while Big Mamie was selling Jean Bart's 16-inch cars for a living, these P-40s were stuck on the bench for the entire opening season.
Don't take me out, Coach! I can still race!
The 33rd would eventually be demolished due to combat losses over places like El Alamein, continuing to prove that even the later P-40s were simply not forgiving to rookies. But in the hands of a skilled pilot, or if they had the element of surprise, the P-40 was absolutely deadly. Like I said before, choosing the right position to penetrate the enemy formation from was important. And some of the slightly easier fights they chose came after the Allies started pushing the Germans back into Tunisia, who began trying to extract supplies in expectation of an offensive in Italy. One of the more well-known aerial battles of this campaign happened on April 18, 1943. 4 squadrons of P-40s and their Spitfire escorts were running anti-transport patrols and managed to catch a massive aerial convoy of supplies. Transports and their escorts had left Tunisia and were hugging the deck to try and go unnoticed. Unfortunately for them, though, the P-40s did in fact notice that there was a lot of kills available to be claimed, and they would shoot down 59 transports and 16 escort fighters to the loss of only 6 P-40s and 1 Spitfire. And because that also happened to be Palm Sunday, or the Sunday before Easter in the Christian faith, and the fact that many Germans and Italians were suddenly made very holy with their baptism of fire, the battle that day would go down in history as the Palm Sunday Massacre. 12 more supply transports were shot down the next day, and after attacks like these, the transporters would find it awful hard to fly supplies out from Tunisia when there wasn't any air to fly through. The P-40's activity would virtually kill all extraction attempts, both speeding up the end of the North African campaign and denting the German war machine as a whole. And when the North African campaign ended, these Warhawks would then be set out to deal damage to enemy air forces at home to stop them from being used in defense of Sicily during the planned landings, where the soon-to-be infamous Checker Tails would go out and take 102 names to the loss of 16 planes. But these guys also had a habit of making Geneva shit itself trying to keep up with the list additions, because one pilot took a fin set and a grenade and modified his gas tank into a makeshift firebomb, so that whenever he ran out of gas, he could just pick something in the middle of nowhere, say "F you" in particular, light it on fire, and leave. At least he did that for a while before he was told to stop for safety reasons. I guess the convention wasn't quite sure which article flaming nutsack dragging fit under. The P-40s would continue in the more conventional ground support role after Sicily was taken, but they would slowly be replaced by my favorite airplane, the Thunderbolt, towards the end of 1943. And by the summer of 1944, the only P-40s in service and active combat squadrons were the ones used by the British Commonwealth nations, including in the South Pacific, where the P-47 and the P-38 had really taken the weight off its shoulders. The last campaign that saw the P-40 used in large numbers was the Solomon Islands campaign in 1943, where 117.5 kills were scored by the 44th Fighter Squadron. These guys were taking out Japanese planes like they were going for the hundreds club in a bowling score. There was also a slight anecdote added to its history in 1942 when Canadian P-40s helped the Americans punch the Japanese in the nuts when they tried to take the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese touched America's boats, now they tried to touch America's land, so they didn't stick around for very long. And those Canadian P-40s would also become the F-22's spiritual ancestor when they shot down some of those bomb balloons that Japan sent over at the end of the war as some last-ditch middle fingers. But after September 1944, P-40s were not operated by any dedicated fighter squadrons, and pretty much the only thing they were doing was looking for people or teaching people until the end of the war, with the only real exception being its last aerial victory in the retaking of the Philippines on January 29, 1945. Granted, that still meant the P-40 had served for the entirety of the Pacific War, as well as all over the world. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh right, Russia! They served with Russia. While the P-40 was definitely valuable to the Soviet defenses, it was probably less appreciated by the communists than the capitalists. You would think that the Soviets, who largely fought at low altitudes, would have enjoyed a plane designed around low-altitude combat. And you would be wrong, because not only was the P-40 not popular with the Soviets, it was only beaten for the title of least favorite by the Hurricane. It wasn't because of the Germans, that they could handle just fine, and it wasn't because of the pilots or the mechanics. They did the best they could with what they had. The Soviet hate boner for the aircraft simply came from a perfect storm of bureaucratic bullshit and the fact that the Soviets never could build a proper oil industry without help. The first impressions weren't all that great either. Many of the first 120 to 130 planes delivered in late 1941 were either used, broken, or incomplete. Some of them didn't even have engines or guns on board, and some of the others had either no bullets or the wrong bullets. Naturally, this kind of failed bulk DoorDash kind of pissed off the Soviets, and they left a lot of one-star reviews behind even after they started getting in ones that worked. But the other problem was that the Soviets first got their P-40s in the winter. And if you go through any account of wars in Russia, anyone having to deal with Russian winter that isn't from Russia
Are without a doubt a member of the worst generation ever.
And the P-40s were no exception. Tires cracked, batteries burst, engines seized, and 38 of the first P-40s received had their radiators crack themselves open even with antifreeze. The Soviets ended up confiscating all the silverware from the villages surrounding the airbase just to have enough solder for the welding. But it's the problem with the bearings in particular that makes me laugh. See, the Allison 1710s came with new technology at the time for high-performance engines. The crankshaft bearings were plated with silver and lead. These materials are known in particular for their embeddability, or the ability to allow contaminants in the lubricating oil to embed themselves in the bearing to stay out of the way of the engine shaft. But in the Soviet Union, these bearings usually failed on takeoff, and in the air they contributed to several deaths, so much so that pilots often mocked these bearings as the miracle of non-engine aviation. But when I was looking through these reports, what I found really curious is that while this wasn't extensive problems for the Soviets, it was never reported as an issue for America or even its allies.
I don't know what the you're talking about.
And more to that point, silver crankshaft bearings are still in widespread use today. They're supposed to be more damage resistant, but for some reason in Soviet service they were the opposite. If they had been a circumstantial technology at best, or simply couldn't keep up with advances in engine tech, they would have been replaced by more advanced materials by now. But silver-plated bearings are still around and kicking and still advertised for the same kinds of high-performance engines. So if the bearings themselves weren't the problem, the question then becomes, what was the difference between the bearings on the American P-40s and the Soviet P-40s?
The word that just made every American, including myself, salivate.
See, the Soviet petroleum industry of World War II wasn't exactly known for high quality. Russian gasoline usually carried a lot of acidic impurities, and lubricating oil was well below Western standards. It was so bad, some engine designers found it easier to make engines that were better able to withstand the abuse of the low-quality oil and gas than wait for the Soviets to make better oil and gas. And here's a fun fact: two of the most common metals in chemistry textbook examples for simple simple acid-base reactions are lead and silver. They are some of the most consistently dissolvable metals when exposed to acid, meaning that when the exhaust fumes from Soviet fuel made it into the engine crankshaft, because engines aren't perfectly contained systems, it would hit the cold oil during engine startup and condense into acidic sludge, which meant the silver and lead on your bearings might as well have gone to Hogwarts because it's about to pull a magic trick and disappear. And since Soviet winters were so goddamn cold the oil could freeze, that meant the oil spent more time being cold while the engine was running, and thus the engine spent more time being eaten alive by the industrial consequences of the Bolshevik Revolution. Translation: anything with an Allison engine in the Soviet Union would be as available as communist food within a couple of months at best. Capitalism and communism don't mix, and even the planes know it, and while the Soviets would receive roughly 120 and some change planes in that late 1941 batch, by as soon as January 1942, only 9 of them could actually fly. And you could forget fixing them because they were constantly running out of spare parts. They tried to modify the P-40s to use Soviet parts like radiators and tires, but this was largely unsuccessful. The only idea that worked was following the general rule of more DACA and bolting on the occasional racks of RS-82 rockets. Seriously, if you were to put the Soviet P-40's causes of death on a leaderboard, first place would go to self-disassembly and second place would go to German disassembly. It didn't help that in early 1943, some newer pilots had a bad habit of constantly redlining the engine into war emergency power because they couldn't hear the difference in tone like with the Russian ones. And as a result, they would burn out the engine in 10 minutes flat and be stuck with a plane that couldn't even break 250 miles or 400 knot miles an hour. By later that year, the P-40 was pretty much only in service with the air forces belonging to the PVO, the Backline National Guard, and the Soviet Navy, or VVS-VMF, where they were stuck trying to intercept bombers at night with no night fighting equipment. And yet, despite that long list of shortcomings, war doesn't give you the luxury of being picky.
You'll do it because it must be done.
Because consequences be damned, the P-40s would fight in every major Soviet engagement. Not one step back, after all. Moscow, Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kuban, Kursk, even the liberation of Eastern Prussia. If you looked up in the sky, you'd probably see at least one P-40 mixing it up with the enemy, even if they never were a deciding factor. Some Soviet pilots even had decent success with the airplane. The first squadron to use the P-40s, the 126th IAP, developed specialized group tactics for using the aircraft, using multi-layered formations and in-flight coordination to make 12 aces and get 31 pilots decorated for the Battle of Moscow. Other pilots were more appreciative of the airframe's toughness, not only for its resistance to bullets, but because the Soviets basically turned ramming into an Olympic sport. And you would not believe the story of the dude who got the gold. This is the most Russian story I've ever heard. This Soviet pilot, Lieutenant Alexei Klobistov, survived ramming not one, but 2 German aircraft, a Bf-110 and a Bf-109, in that order. This absolute lunatic hit the bigger of the 2 planes first, took one look over at his wing and was like, I can do that again, and proceeded to smack somebody else. And he did it in the same mission with the same point on the wing, and then flew home with that wing still attached to his airplane.
Selenium. It's the densest metal known to man, and it's only found in Russia. It might not exist at all because there are a lot of lies in that government.
And they say Russian bias isn't real. Ultimately, the Soviet Union, which had been the second nation to import the P-40s besides Britain, would become the 3rd largest operator of the aircraft of the eventual 28 nations to do so, taking inventory of 2,097 P-40s ranging from the C model to the N model. But times change, and by 1944, the P-40 had been phased out of Soviet service entirely. The last P-40 wouldn't be retired from the American side of the pond until 1948, which for some reason was redesignated the ZF-40N, making it an administrative aircraft and probably some general's personal plane. The next year, P-40s would see their last use in combat by the Dutch in February, fighting against the Indonesian rebels in their war for independence. But the Warhawks still wouldn't fully rest until 1958, when Brazil finally retired there. Seriously, what is it with Brazil and hanging on to old prop planes for decades past their expiration date? But with that, the long story of the P-40, America's most available fighter, would finally come to a close. So in summation, the P-40 was not a great plane. It was also not a terrible one. But the reason you should remember it isn't because of the Warhawk's capability or lack thereof. It's because it was available when nothing else could be. One grit on a piece of sandpaper can't do much on its own, but when assembled in large numbers and usefully arranged, enough force, technique, and time is all you really need to wear down even the toughest of walls. And the P-40 may have felt like sandpaper to the people that flew it, rough, painful, and at times awkward to use, but it wore down the Japanese and especially the Germans just enough to make the real demolishers that much scarier, because it left them thinking one thing: if they could hold their own with what's available, then what can they do when they're ready? Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description and now underneath the video in your standard viewing window. And if you want to watch my Twitch streams but can't catch them live, go check out my VOD channel linked up in the corner there. And as always, if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.